I had it fixed in my head exactly what sort of woman would step down off that Tuesday coach, and I was wrong about every last particular of her. I'd written for a plain one, a sensible one, a widow, I'd hoped, past the age of foolishness, who could keep a house and salt a hog and not expect a man to make conversation across the supper table when he was bone-tired and his grandfather 4 months in the ground. I'd written it all out at the desk in Holly's Bend by the post office, my hat in my lap, feeling like the worst kind of beggar, because that is what I was. A man begs in 100 quiet ways before he ever begs out loud, and I had run clean out of the quiet ones. So when the coach came rocking in off the Quill River Road that afternoon, throwing up a tail of dust the color of cinnamon, I stood by the freight scales with my hat brim low and my heart down somewhere around my boot soles, and I waited to meet my plain, sensible widow. The first thing off the coach was a trunk, not her trunk of dresses that came later, and it was a modest little thing. This first one was long and flat and banded in iron at the corners, and it hit the boards with a sound like a coffin, and the driver swore at the weight of it. "Mind the strap," a woman's voice said. "There's glass plates in there and I'll know if you've cracked one." Then she came down. She set her own boot on the iron step without waiting for a hand, and she came down quick and sure, and she stood in the street and looked the town of Holly's Bend up and down the way a buyer looks at a horse he half suspects is lame. She was not plain. I want to be honest about that even now, even being the old fool I've become, because it matters to the whole rest of it. She wasn't a beauty in the way the catalogs paint a beauty, all soft and round and helpless. She was tall and spare, with a strong straight nose and a wide mouth set firm, and dark hair pinned up plain under a gray traveling hat, and a pair of eyes that took the measure of everything they landed on. When they landed on me, they did not soften. They added me up like a column of figures. "You'll be Mr. Carroll," she said. "I will," I said. "You're younger than your letter." "I'm 34. Your letter read 60. She came forward and put out her hand to be shaken like a man, and I shook it, and her grip was dry and hard and certain. "Josephine Vane," she said. "Joe, I'll thank you not to call me anything fancier." "I wrote for a widow," I said. It came out blunter than I meant. I was off my feet already and we hadn't been 3 sentences in. "And you got one." Something moved at the corner of her mouth that on a kinder day might have been the beginning of a smile, and on that day was only a kind of grim amusement. "My husband's been dead 2 years, Mr. Carroll. He was a surveyor. I was his assistant and then I was his partner, and when the fever took him, the territory office decided a woman couldn't hold his contracts, so I have spent 2 years teaching other people's children their letters and being told I'm too forward at the church socials." She glanced at the long iron-banded trunk on the boards. "That's his instruments. They're mine now. I'd be obliged if a strong fellow carried that end." I carried that end. I will tell you it weighed more than any wife had a right to weigh, and I hauled it up into the wagon bed, and she climbed up onto the seat beside me without being asked, arranged her skirts, folded her hands, and looked out at the country like she was already deciding what was wrong with it. We rode the 8 miles out to Dovetail Flat without much in the way of talk. I tried twice. Both times she answered me square and short and then said nothing more, and I was raised by a man who taught me that a quiet that's working is better than a noise that isn't, so I let it be. The land rolled out gold and gray under a high-washed sky, the Quill running low and brown off to our right, the cottonwoods along it just going to leaf. My grandfather's land. My land now, on a paper I could no longer afford to keep. When the house came up over the rise, she sat forward a little. It wasn't much. A long, low log house Amos built with his own 2 hands 40 years gone, a barn that needed its north side reshingled, a windmill, a corral, the home pasture running down to the river and the rough country climbing away behind to the dry benches and the broken red rock where nothing grew but cactus and trouble. It was the prettiest place in the world to me, and I knew exactly how it looked to a stranger, like a thing on its way to being lost. "How many head?" she said. 200 and some. Was 800 before the hard winter and the worst summer. And you owe the bank. I looked at her. Now how would you know that? Mr. Carroll. She said my name the way a teacher says a slow boy's name, patient and a little tired. A man with 800 head and a paid deed does not write to a registry for a plain, sensible wife and offer her nothing but room and board and honest work. He courts the banker's daughter. You're drowning. You wrote for someone who'd take you anyway. She faced front again. I'm not insulting you. I answered the letter. I knew what it was when I answered it. I'm only telling you I can read what's in front of me. It's a thing I'm good at. You'll find it more useful than you think. I didn't have one word to say to that. Not one. I clucked to the team and we rolled down to the house. And that was how my wife came to me, not soft, not grateful, not anything I'd braced myself for, but with her dead husband's surveying tools in an iron trunk, and a way of looking at the world that took me 4 months and a fortune to understand was the best thing that ever happened to the Carroll name. We were married 3 days later in the front room by a circuit preacher named Pell who smelled of horse and peppermint, with my hand Doan and his wife as witnesses, and I will tell you honestly there was no romance in it. Joe wore a gray dress, not a white one. She said her vows in a clear, flat voice like she was reading off an inventory. When Pell said I might kiss her, she turned her cheek to me, businesslike, and I kissed her cheek, and her skin was warm and she smelled of road dust and ink, and I stepped back feeling like a man who has signed a thing he doesn't fully understand. That night I slept in the lean-off room I'd built onto the back, and she had the bedroom, and we did not speak of it, and that was the arrangement for a good long while. I want to say that plain too. There were people in Holly's Bend later who liked to whisper that I'd bought myself a fancy woman cheap, and it was a lie that made my fists ache, because the truth was the opposite of cheap, and there was no buying in it. We were 2 grown people who'd each been knocked flat by life and had decided, separately and for our own reasons, to try standing up leaning against each other. That's a marriage too. Sometimes it's the only kind that lasts, because it's built honest from the floor up. I learned fast that I had not married a housekeeper. Oh, she kept the house. She kept it better than I'd kept it, which wasn't saying a great deal, a bachelor's house being mostly a way station for mud. But she had no particular love for it and made no secret of that. The bread came out fine and she did not care whether I admired it. What she loved, what lit her up like a lamp turned high, was the country itself and the reading of it. She'd be out before me some mornings, the iron trunk open on the porch, setting up her dead husband's tripod and brass transit on the high ground behind the house, sighting down the lines of my own land like she meant to buy it out from under me. She kept a leather book, and she filled it with little neat figures and tiny drawings, the bend of the river, the rise of the benches, the way the dry washes ran when they ran at all. She'd come in at dusk with red dust to her elbows and ink on her thumb, and that grim mouth of hers loosened just slightly, almost happy, and she'd say something like, "Your east fence is laid out drunk, Mr. Carroll. You've given the road 40 feet you didn't owe it." And I'd find out next week she was right to the inch. "You can call me Wheeze," I told her one evening maybe 3 weeks in, "seeing as we're wed." She looked up from her book. "All right," she said, "Wheeze," and went back to her figures. But she said it easier the next time, and easier the time after, and I noticed that, the way a man dying of thirst notices the first far smell of water. It was the back country that broke the thing open between us, the dry benches and the red rock where nothing grew, the very land everybody in Holly's Bend agreed was worthless. My grandfather had loved that ground beyond all sense. As a boy, I'd thought it was just an old man's stubbornness. He'd ride me out there on the gray mule, and we'd sit our animals at the lip of the Cinnabar Wash, that long crooked gash of red and rust-colored rock running back into the hills, and he'd look at it the way Joe looked at her figures, like it was telling him something, and he'd say, "Wesley, a man's fortune is mostly under his own feet, and he never owns it till he learns to read the ground he stands on." I thought it was the kind of thing old men say. I was a boy. I wanted my supper. He died in the bad winter, Amos did, of a cough that went down into his chest and stayed. He died hard, and he died with something on his mind. The last clear night he had, he gripped my wrist with that old claw of a hand, strong as iron even then, and he made me fetch the ledger. It was a great ugly book bound in cracked black leather, the ranch accounts going back to before I was born, every steer and every sack of flour and every dollar borrowed and paid. He turned to the back of it where the pages were blank, and he set his thumb on a page that wasn't blank, that had on it a mess of his cramped figures and a little drawing and a line of words that made no sense, and he said, "You read that when the wolf's at the door, Wesley. Not before. You'll know the day. It's all there. Everything I put by." He coughed and he couldn't get his breath right, and he said, "I never trusted that bank, boy, and you shouldn't either." And those were near to the last sensible words he spoke to me. And then the fever took his mind, and 3 days later it took the rest, and we buried him on the knoll under the lone cottonwood where my grandmother already lay. I'd looked at that page 100 times in the 4 months since. It was gibberish. Numbers that weren't dollars, words that weren't a sentence, a little drawing of what might have been a bird or a broken arrow or nothing at all. I decided it was the fever already in him when he wrote it, that there was nothing there, that the old man's mind had gone soft at the end the way minds do, and I'd shut the ledger and gone back to the slow business of losing everything in an orderly fashion. The wolf came to the door on a Thursday, in a buggy, wearing a good coat. His name was Halloran, and he owned the bank in Holly's Bend, and a fair piece of everything the bank had ever loaned against. He was a smooth, heavy, smiling man, and he came out to Dovetail Flat that Thursday with a clerk and a paper, and he stood in my yard and told me, all regret, that the note Amos had taken against the ranch in the bad winter was come due in 60 days, and that the bank could not, of course, extend it again, times being what they were, and that he was sure a sensible man would see that the kindest thing was an orderly sale before it came to a sheriff's auction. Which was so undignified for a family of standing. He smiled the whole while. He had a way of making a threat sound like he was doing you a favor by it. I knew the note. I knew I couldn't pay it. 200 head wouldn't cover the half. I stood there in my own yard with my hat in my hand again, begging in the quiet way, and I felt the last of the ground going out from under me. And then Joe came out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron, and she said, pleasant as you please, "How much is the note, Mr. Halloran?" Halloran's smile slipped just a hair. He didn't like a woman in the conversation. "Mrs. Carrow," he said, tipping his hat, "this is men's business and dull as ditch water. You needn't trouble." "How much?" she said again, not loud, just flat the way she said everything, a fact wanting another fact to sit beside it. He told her, because there's a kind of woman a man like that can't quite figure how to refuse without looking small in front of his clerk. He told her the figure, and it was a brutal one, and the clerk wrote something, and Halloran turned back to me and went on about the kindness of an orderly sale. But Joe had already gone still in that way she had when she was reading something. She was looking at Halloran's buggy, at the team, at the good coat and the gold chain across his vest. And when he and his clerk had finished their pleasant little execution and rolled off back toward town, she stood on the porch a long minute watching the dust of them. "That man," she said, "is too rich for a town this poor." "He's the bank," I said. "Banks are rich. This bank loans against scrub cattle outfits 8 miles from a railhead. There's no fortune in that. He dresses like the railhead came to him." She turned and looked at me with those level eyes. "Wheeze, when did your grandfather take that note?" "Bad winter, 3 years gone." "For how much?" I told her. She frowned. "That's a great deal of money for a man to need in one winter. What did he do with it? Did the herd grow? Did he build?" "No," I said slowly, because I had never once asked myself the question, and it landed on me now like a cold hand. "No, the herd kept shrinking. He never built a thing. He just got closed up, secret. The last year he'd ride out to the back country for a day at a time, and not say where." Joe Vane went very still. And then she said the words that turned the whole key in the whole lock of my life, though neither of us knew it yet. "Wheeze," she said, "show me everything he left, every paper, every book. I don't care if it's gibberish, especially if it's gibberish." I brought out the black ledger that night and laid it open on the table by the lamp, to the page in the back I'd given up on, and I told her I figured it for the fever talking, for nothing. She didn't answer me for a long while. She'd pulled the lamp close and bent her head over the page and gone somewhere I couldn't follow, and her finger moved over his cramped figures slow and light, like she was reading them by touch as much as sight. The fire ticked. Outside, an owl went over the river. I sat across from her and I watched my wife's face in the lamplight, the strong nose, the firm mouth gone soft now with concentration, a strand of dark hair come loose against her cheek, and I felt something turn over in me that had been lying still and cold since the winter Amos died. I told myself it was hope about the money. It was not entirely about the money. I knew that even then. I just wasn't ready to know it out loud. "These aren't accounts," she said at last, quiet. "They look like accounts. They're meant to. He's hidden it in plain sight in the one book a banker'd be bored to flip through." She turned the ledger so I could see and put her ink-stained thumb on a column. "Look, he's writing these as dollars and cents, but a man who kept books his whole life, and he did, this whole book is clean and right, that man does not suddenly forget that you carry the cents in 2 figures, not 3. He's got 3 figures after every point. Those aren't cents, Wheeze. Those are minutes. And these aren't dollars, they're degrees." Her voice had quickened, that lamp-turned high light coming up in her. "This is a bearing. This whole column is bearings and distances. It's a traverse. Your grandfather wrote you a survey and dressed it up as a debt so nobody but kin would ever bother to read it." I didn't understand the half of what she'd said, but I understood the shape of it, and the shape of it set my heart going hard. A survey to where? To wherever he was riding all those days he wouldn't tell you. She sat back. She looked at the little drawing in the margin, the bird or the broken arrow or the nothing. "And this isn't a bird," she said softly. "It's a wash. See, that's the way a wash forks when you draw it from above. Your grandfather drew the country looking down on it like a map because his granddaughter-in-law's husband taught her to. I'd know that fork anywhere. I've been drawing it for 3 weeks. She lifted her eyes to mine, and for the first and only time that night she smiled, a real one, wide and quick and astonished. "Wheeze. It's the cinnabar wash. He buried it in the back country. Whatever it is. Everything he put by, he said that, didn't he? You told me everything I put by. He didn't lose that money in the winter. He took it out of the bank in cash because he never trusted the bank, and he hid it on his own land. And he wrote you the map and made you swear not to read it till the wolf was at the door." She laughed once, disbelieving. "The wolf is at the door." I have thought about that night for 40 years. I have thought about how close I came to never knowing, how if I'd married my plain, sensible widow, the meek one, the one I'd ordered up like a sack of flour, she'd have kept my house just fine, and that ledger would have gone for kindling, and old Amos's last gift to me would have burned up cold in a stove. It was the wrong wife who saved me. The one who wasn't anything I bargained for. The one who could read. We rode out to the cinnabar wash the next dawn, the 2 of us, because I wouldn't have her staying behind for the world, and she'd have come anyway. She rode astride in a split skirt she'd sewn for it, easy in the saddle, the leather book in her coat and the brass transit lashed behind her, and the morning came up red over the broken country and lit her face, and I thought, looking at her, that I had stopped, somewhere in the last weeks, thinking of her as a stranger I'd sent for. I just hadn't gotten around to telling myself what I thought of her instead. The work was hard and it was slow, and it was nothing like a treasure tale. There was no chest with a skull on it. There was a woman with a brass instrument running her dead husband's lines off her dead grandfather-in-law's coded figures, walking the chains out under a hard sun, calling numbers back to me while I drove stakes, the 2 of us creeping up that red wash bearing by bearing while the sweat ran and the buzzards turned. Twice we lost the line and had to ride back to the last sure stake and start again. Once she sat down on a rock and put her head in her hands, and I thought she'd quit, and I came and stood by her not knowing what to do with my hands, and she looked up, and there was dust caked to the tracks of sweat on her face, and she said, "He made it hard on purpose, Wheeze. He made it so only somebody who loved you enough to bother would ever find it." And then she got up and went on, and I have loved her for that sentence every day since. It was late afternoon of the second day when the last bearing brought us to a place under a leaning slab of red rock at the head of the wash, in the shade, where a man could sit out of the sun, where an old man had surely sat many a long day with his secret. The figures ran out. The traverse closed. Joe stood over the spot and looked down at the ground and said, very quiet, "Here." And I got down on my knees in the red dirt and dug with my hands and then with the spade, and about 2 feet down the spade rang on iron. It was a strongbox, Amos's old strongbox, the one I'd thought sold years back, wrapped in oilcloth and a wagon sheet against the wet. And inside it, when I finally got the rusted lock broke off with a rock, was my grandfather's whole, long, stubborn life. Gold coin and silver coin in canvas pokes furred with age, and a packet of greenbacks oiled and folded, and the original deed to Dovetail flat free and clear of any bank, and a letter in his cramped hand that began Wesley. If you are reading this, then she is real and you found her, the one who could read it, and that is worth more than what's in the box, and never let go of her, and ended with him telling me he'd loved me since the day my dead father first set me in his arms, and that a man's fortune is mostly under his own feet, and he was sorry he'd been too hard a man to ever say so out loud. We sat in the shade of the red rock a long time, the two of us, with the box open between us and the old man's money cool in our hands, and the buzzards giving up on us at last, and the long light coming gold down the cinnabar wash. Joe read the letter twice. The second time her voice went unsteady at the part about the one who could read it, and she stopped, and she didn't try to go on, and she folded it up small and held it in both hands in her lap, and I saw 2 clean tracks run down through the dust on her face. "He never met me," she said. "He'd have liked you," I said. "He'd have liked you better than he liked me." She laughed at that, a wet broken little laugh, and she wiped her face with the heel of her dusty hand and only smeared it worse, and I reached over without thinking and wiped a streak of the dust from her cheek with my thumb the way you'd do for a child, and she went still, and I went still, and we sat there in the red dust with my hand on her face and the whole world holding its breath. "This is enough money," she said carefully, not pulling away, "to pay Halloran's note 3 times over. You don't owe anything to anyone now, Wheeze. The ranch is yours, free and clear." She paused. "You don't need a wife to hold it for you anymore. You could," she stopped. "I could what?" "You sent for a sensible woman to keep a house and save a ranch." Her eyes came up to mine steady, but I'd learned to read her too, by then, a little the way she'd taught me to read the ground, and under the steadiness there was something braced for a blow. "The ranch is saved. I'm a survey partner with no contracts and a trunk of instruments and a sharp tongue every church social in 3 counties has warned you about. I'd not blame you for an honest accounting. I can read that ground too. I have never been a man for speeches. Amos wasn't either, and it cost him at the end, and he knew it, and he told me so in a letter from beyond the grave that I had not 3 hours since pulled out of the dirt. So I made myself say the thing out loud, because I had just learned hard what it costs a man to leave the truest things unsaid. "Joe," I said, "I sent for a wife to save the ranch, but it wasn't the ranch you saved." My voice came out rough and I let it. "I've been a widower of a different kind a long while, buried up with my granddad and my own sorry self out here, reading nothing, owning nothing, not even the dirt under my boots, just like he said. You're the one taught me how to read it. You're the fortune woman. The box is just the box." I took a breath. "I didn't court you. I bought a notion out of a registry, and I got you instead, which was the best mistake I ever made and the cheapest, and I'd undo it all and do it proper if you'd let me. I'd court you now today, in the dirt, if you'll have a hard man who's only lately learned to say a soft thing." She looked at me a long, long moment. The light was going. Far off the first star came out over the red rock. "You're courting me," she said. in a hole in the ground, sitting on a dead man's money, with mud on both our faces. I am. It's the least romantic proposal in the history of the territory. It is. And Josephine Vane, Joe Caro, by a paper, but not yet by anything that counted, leaned across the open box and the cool old coin and the letter from a man who'd loved us both, and she kissed me. Not the cheek this time. She kissed me square and certain and unhurried, the way she did everything, like a fact at last laid down beside the fact it had been looking for. And the dust was gritty between us, and I did not care. And somewhere up on the knoll under the lone cottonwood I believe my grandfather rested a little easier in the cooling ground. There's not much left to tell, and what there is good, and goodness tells short. We paid Halloran his note in full in Holly's Bend the following week in coin, on the counter, in front of his clerk, and I will admit it is one of the small mean pleasures of my long life to remember the color his smooth face turned. Joe had been right about him, of course. She was right about most things. With a real surveyor herself, finally allowed to put a transit on the country, it came clear within the year that Halloran had been quietly mismarking section lines for a decade, shaving a strip off every poor outfit's deed when their notes came due, and folding the land into his own holdings, which is how a banker in a town that poor came to dress so rich. It wasn't a gunfight that finished him. It was my wife and her brass instrument and her neat little book of figures, laid before a territorial judge who could add. He left Holly's Bend in a hurry and not in a good coat, and the small ruined outfits all up and down, the quill got their stolen 40 and 60 feet back, surveyed true and free by Mrs. Caro, who would not take $1 for it. The ranch came back. We bought good stock with Amos's gold, and the grass was kind to us and the herd grew, and Joe never did learn to love housekeeping and I never did make her, and we hired a girl from town for the bread and the both of us were happier for it. She kept surveying. The territory that had told a widow she couldn't hold a contract found it had no answer at all for a married woman whose husband cheerfully sent her out with the chains and the transit and bragged on her in the saloon. And inside 3 years half the honest deeds in the county were drawn in her clean hand. She is the reason the section corners around here are true to this day. Folks have forgotten that. I haven't. We had our children out on Dovetail Flat, a boy and 2 girls, all grown now and scattered to their own good lives, and I taught every one of them to ride out to the head of the Cinnabar Wash and sit their horses in the shade of the leaning red rock. And I told them every time the same thing their great-great-grandfather told a boy who only wanted his supper, that a man's fortune is mostly under his own feet, and he never owns it until he learns to read the ground he stands on. The little ones thought it was just the kind of thing old men say. They wanted their suppers. I let them go get them. They'll understand it the day the wolf comes to one of their doors and not one day before, and that's the right of it. That's how Amos meant it. Joe's beside me yet this many years on, grayer than her dark hair ever promised and still with that level eye that adds a man up and finds him, on the whole, acceptable. Her dead husband's brass transit stands polished on the mantel where the rifle ought to be by rights, and I would not have it any other way, for it brought me everything. Some nights when the lamps turned high I'll catch her bent over a map with that loose strand of hair against her cheek, gone silver now, somewhere I can't quite follow, and I'll feel the same thing turn over in me it turned that first night over the ledger, and I know now to say it out loud. I sent away for a plain, sensible woman to keep my house and save my ranch. What stepped down off that Tuesday coach was the only person on this earth who could read what my grandfather left me. In the dirt and in the ledger and in my own closed-up heart, and she read all 3 true, and she stayed, not because she had to, for she could have ridden off a rich woman the day we opened that box, but because she chose to, with her eyes open and her own counsel kept, the way she chose everything. That's the fortune. That was always the fortune. The box was just the box.